The Forgotten Battalion. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating Base Sentinel, a remote outpost in the heart of enemy territory. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the command tent, watching the horizon through her binoculars. Something was wrong. The radio chatter that should have been coming from Bravo Company had gone silent 3 hours ago, and the knot in her stomach was growing by the minute. Sarah had been in the Marine Corps for 15 years, rising through the ranks with a reputation for never leaving anyone behind. At 38, she commanded respect from both her superiors and subordinates. Her weathered face told stories of countless missions, but her steel blue eyes still held the fire that had driven her to join the Corps straight out of college. The mission briefing that morning had seemed routine enough. 340 Marines from the 2nd Battalion were tasked with securing a strategic valley that intelligence reports claimed was lightly defended. They were supposed to establish a perimeter, clear any remaining insurgents, and hold the position until reinforcements arrived. It should have been a textbook operation. But in this godforsaken corner of Afghanistan, nothing ever went according to plan. The Taliban had been unusually quiet in recent weeks, which should have been the first warning sign. Sarah had learned to trust her instincts over the years, and right now, every instinct was screaming that something had gone terribly wrong. Major James, her executive officer, approached with a grim expression. "Ma'am, we've lost all communication with Bravo Company. Last transmission was at 800 hours. They reported reaching the objective and beginning their sweep." Sarah lowered her binoculars and turned to face him. Was a good officer, methodical and reliable, but she could see the concern etched on his face. "What about air support? Any eyes on their position?" "Negative. The sandstorm that rolled through this morning grounded all aircraft. Satellite imagery is compromised due to the dust cloud still covering the area. We're flying blind." The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Standard protocol dictated that they wait for the weather to clear before attempting any rescue operation. Command would expect them to follow proper channels, request authorization, and wait for backup. But Sarah knew that in combat, waiting often meant death. She walked over to the tactical map spread across a folding table. The valley where Bravo Company had been deployed was marked with red pins. It was surrounded by high ground on 3 sides, with only one viable exit route. If the Taliban had been planning an ambush, they couldn't have asked for a better killing field. "What's the terrain like between here and their last known position?" she asked, studying the topographical lines. Joined her at the map. "Rough country, ma'am. Narrow passes, lots of places for IEDs. The road they took is the only practical route for vehicles, but it's completely exposed in several sections." Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. 340 Marines were potentially trapped or worse in that valley. Every minute they waited decreased the chances of bringing them home alive. But launching a rescue mission without proper authorization could end her career, especially if it failed. The radio crackled to life, and both officers turned toward it hopefully. But instead of word from Bravo Company, it was command headquarters requesting a status update. Sarah picked up the handset, knowing that her next words would determine the fate of hundreds of men and women. "Command, this is Sentinel Base. We have a communication blackout with Bravo Company. Request immediate authorization for search and rescue operation." The response came back quickly, and it wasn't what she wanted to hear. "Negative, Sentinel. Weather conditions prohibit air support. Stand by until conditions improve. Do not attempt ground rescue without proper backup." Sarah stared at the radio for a long moment. She could follow orders, wait for the storm to pass, and hope that Bravo Company was simply dealing with equipment failure. Or she could trust her gut and the oath she had taken to never abandon her fellow Marines. The silence in the command tent was deafening. Watched her carefully, knowing the impossible decision she was facing. Outside, the wind howled across the desert, carrying with it the sand and dust that had already delayed any chance of air support for hours. Finally, Sarah made her choice. She began gathering her gear and checking her weapon. "James, prep 2 squads for immediate departure. We're going after them." "Ma'am, command just ordered us to stand down." Sarah looked him straight in the eye. "Then I guess I'm about to break some rules," into the storm. Within 30 minutes, Sarah had assembled a convoy of 4 armored vehicles carrying 48 Marines. She handpicked each soldier, choosing veterans who had served multiple tours and wouldn't hesitate to follow her into hell itself. The sandstorm was still raging, reducing visibility to less than 50 meters, but Sarah knew they couldn't wait any longer. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos climbed into the lead vehicle beside Sarah. At 29, Santos was one of the most decorated non-commissioned officers in the battalion. She had saved countless lives during her 3 deployments and had earned Sarah's complete trust. Her dark eyes reflected the same determination that drove Sarah forward. "You know this is career suicide if we're wrong," Santos said quietly as they checked their communications equipment one final time. Sarah adjusted her helmet and looked out at the swirling sand. "And it's actual suicide for Bravo Company if we're right and do nothing." The convoy rolled out of Fob Sentinel at 1100 hours, disappearing into the brown wall of dust and wind. The route to the valley was treacherous under normal conditions, but the sandstorm made it nearly impossible to navigate. Sarah relied on GPS coordinates and her years of experience reading the land to guide them through the maze of rocky outcroppings and narrow passes. 20 miles into their journey, they encountered the first sign of trouble. A supply truck from Bravo Company sat abandoned on the side of the road, its windows shattered and equipment scattered. There were no bodies, but dark stains in the sand told a grim story. "Dismount and search the vehicle," Sarah ordered over the radio. "Look for any intelligence about what happened here." Santos led a small team to investigate while the rest of the convoy maintained a defensive perimeter. What they found confirmed Sarah's worst fears. The truck's radio had been destroyed by small arms fire, and spent shell casings littered the ground around the vehicle. Most telling was the pattern of the brass, which indicated the Marines had been caught in a crossfire from multiple directions. "Ma'am, this wasn't a chance encounter," Santos reported as they remounted their vehicles. "This was a coordinated ambush, professional work." The convoy pushed deeper into hostile territory as the storm began to intensify. Sand whipped across their windshields with such force that the wipers were useless. Sarah had to rely on the vehicle commander's thermal imaging system to avoid driving off the narrow mountain road that served as their only route to the valley. As they navigated a particularly treacherous section of switchbacks, the radio erupted with frantic chatter. "Contact front! We have enemy fighters in the rocks." The lead vehicle came under immediate fire from concealed positions high above the road. Muzzle flashes sparked through the swirling dust as insurgents opened up with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Sarah's convoy was trapped in the same type of ambush that had likely caught Bravo Company. "Return fire! Get us out of this kill zone!" Sarah shouted into her headset while simultaneously coordinating with her driver to find cover. The Marines responded with disciplined firepower, their training taking over despite the chaotic conditions. Machine gunners in the turrets laid down suppressing fire while the convoy attempted to push through the ambush. But the insurgents had chosen their position well, and the narrow road offered little room to maneuver. An RPG struck the third vehicle in the convoy, sending it careening into a boulder. Black smoke poured from its engine compartment as the crew fought to escape before it caught fire completely. Sarah watched through her rear-view mirror as Marines dragged their wounded comrades to safety while under continuous fire. "Santos, take half the squad and flank them from the left. We need to break up their position before they bring in reinforcements," Sarah commanded. Santos acknowledged and led her team up the rocky slope under cover of smoke grenades. The firefight raged for 20 minutes before the Marines finally gained the upper hand. When the shooting stopped, they had killed or wounded at least a dozen insurgents, but the cost had been high. 3 Marines were seriously wounded, and one of their vehicles was completely destroyed. As the medical corpsmen tended to the wounded, Sarah studied the tactical situation. The ambush had been too well coordinated to be a coincidence. The insurgents knew exactly where to position themselves and when to strike. Someone had been feeding them intelligence about Marine movements. But more disturbing was what they found when they searched the insurgent positions. Among the weapons and equipment left behind were American-made radios and night vision goggles. The serial numbers had been filed off, but Sarah recognized the gear. It was the same type issued to Bravo Company. "They've been monitoring our communications," she told Santos grimly. "That's how they knew we were coming." Santos examined one of the captured radios. "If they've been listening to our traffic, they know about Bravo Company's mission. This whole thing could be a trap designed to draw in rescue forces." Sarah considered the possibility. It would explain the perfect positioning of the ambush and the advanced warning the insurgents seemed to have about Marine movements. But it didn't change her mission. 340 Marines were still missing, and she was their only hope for survival. The convoy resumed its journey with one less vehicle and several wounded Marines, but Sarah's resolve had only strengthened. The evidence of coordination between different insurgent groups suggested that Bravo Company had walked into something much larger than a simple patrol mission. They were facing a sophisticated enemy that had been planning this operation for weeks, possibly months. As they approached the final pass before reaching the valley, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. She ordered radio silence to prevent the insurgents from tracking their approach, knowing that it also meant cutting off their only link to headquarters and any chance of calling for backup. Valley of Death. The sandstorm finally began to clear as Sarah's convoy reached the overlooking the valley where Bravo Company had vanished. What she saw through her binoculars made her blood run cold. The valley floor was littered with burning vehicles and equipment, but there were no signs of the Marines who should have been defending the position. The tactical situation was even worse than she had feared. The valley was completely surrounded by insurgent positions, with heavy weapons emplacements covering every possible escape route. Smoke rose from at least 6 different locations where Marine vehicles had been destroyed, but most disturbing of all was the absence of bodies. In her 15 years of combat experience, Sarah had never seen a battlefield without casualties. Santos crawled up beside her with a spotting scope. "Ma'am, I count at least 200 insurgents in prepared positions. They've got us outnumbered 5-1, and they're dug in like ticks." Sarah studied the terrain more carefully. The insurgents had transformed the valley into a fortress, using natural rock formations and hastily constructed bunkers to create interlocking fields of fire. Any attempt to assault their positions would be suicide for her small force. But somewhere in that valley, 340 Marines were either dead or captured, and she couldn't leave without knowing which. "Do you see any signs of our people?" she asked, passing Santos her binoculars. Santos scanned the valley floor methodically. After several minutes, she lowered the binoculars with a grim expression. "Negative on bodies, but there's something else. Those bunker positions weren't built overnight. This whole operation was planned well in advance." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. The implications were staggering. If the insurgents had been planning this trap for weeks or months, it meant they had intelligence sources within the Marine command structure. Bravo Company hadn't just walked into an ambush. They had been deliberately led into a slaughter. As she watched, a figure emerged from one of the bunkers carrying what appeared to be an American flag. The insurgent tied it to a pole and raised it upside down in the universal distress signal, then began waving it mockingly at where Sarah's team was hidden. "They know we're here," Santos whispered. Before Sarah could respond, her radio crackled to life despite the communications blackout she had ordered. The voice that came through was speaking English with an American accent, but the words made her stomach turn. "Colonel Mitchell, we know you're watching. Your Marines are alive, but not for long. You have 1 hour to surrender your weapons and come down into the valley, or we start executing prisoners." Sarah grabbed the radio handset, her mind racing. How did they know her name and rank? The communications security breach was even worse than she had imagined. But more importantly, the transmission confirmed that at least some of Bravo Company had survived the initial attack. "This is Colonel Mitchell. I want proof of life before we discuss any terms." There was a long pause before the voice responded. "Check your 12 o'clock position, Colonel. We have a present for you." Sarah looked through her binoculars toward the center of the valley. A group of insurgents was dragging 3 figures in Marine uniforms toward an open area where they would be clearly visible. Even at distance, she could see that the Marines were alive but badly beaten. One of the insurgents raised a rifle and pointed it at the head of the kneeling Marine in the center. The message was clear: cooperate or watch your people die one by one. "You have 50 minutes remaining, Colonel. Come alone or we start with the wounded." The radio went silent, leaving Sarah with an impossible choice. If she surrendered, the insurgents would have taken out an entire rescue force along with the original company. But if she refused, she would be condemning hundreds of Marines to death or worse. Santos had been monitoring the radio traffic, and her face reflected the same anguish Sarah felt. "Ma'am, this is a no-win situation. Even if you surrender, there's no guarantee they'll honor any agreement. Sarah knew Santos was right. In her years of fighting insurgents, she had learned that they rarely showed mercy to captured Americans, regardless of any deals that might be struck. But she also couldn't simply abandon Bravo Company without exhausting every possible option. "Get me a count on their ammunition and heavy weapons," she ordered. "I want to know exactly what we're facing if we have to fight our way in." As her Marines conducted reconnaissance of the insurgent positions, Sarah studied the tactical map spread across the hood of their vehicle. The valley was a natural fortress, but every fortress had weaknesses. The question was whether she could find them before time ran out. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Through her binoculars, Sarah watched as more Marines were dragged into view and forced to kneel beside the others. The insurgents were making sure she understood exactly what was at stake. Each new prisoner that appeared made her decision more difficult. With 30 minutes remaining in the ultimatum, Sarah made a choice that would define the rest of her career. She began formulating a plan that violated every rule of military engagement, but might be the only way to save her Marines. It was desperate, dangerous, and probably suicidal, but it was better than surrender. "Santos, I need you to get on the radio to FOB Sentinel. Tell them to prepare for a mass casualty evacuation and to have every available aircraft standing by." Santos looked confused. "Ma'am, we're under communications blackout. If we break radio silence, the insurgents will triangulate our position." Sarah was already moving toward her gear. "That's exactly what I'm counting on. We're going to give them a target they can't resist, and then we're going to make them pay for it." Breaking protocol. Sarah's plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of surrendering or attempting a frontal assault, she intended to use herself as bait to draw the insurgents out of their prepared positions. It was a violation of every tactical doctrine she had ever learned, but sometimes unconventional problems required unconventional solutions. She divided her remaining force into 3 teams. Santos would take 20 Marines and circle around to the eastern ridge, positioning themselves to provide covering fire. Corporal Mike, a sniper with over 100 confirmed kills, would take a small team to the western high ground to eliminate key targets. Sarah would take the remaining Marines directly into the valley, broadcasting their position and movements to ensure the insurgents focused their attention on her team. "Ma'am, this is insane," Santos protested as Sarah outlined the plan. "You're talking about walking into a killing field with no backup and no air support." Sarah checked her weapon one final time. "The insurgents expect us to either surrender or attempt a traditional assault. They're not prepared for a coordinated attack from multiple directions while their attention is focused elsewhere." Studied the insurgent positions through his scope. "I can see at least 6 heavy machine gun positions and what looks like a mortar team. Even if we eliminate the key targets, you'll still be facing overwhelming firepower." Sarah knew he was right, but she also knew that time was running out. Through her binoculars, she could see that more Marines were being brought into the open area where the executions would take place. The insurgents were clearly preparing to make good on their threat. "The key is timing," she explained. "We need to hit them when they're focused on my team and before they can organize their defenses. Santos, you wait for my signal before opening fire. I need you to take out their command structure first, then work on the heavy weapons." The radio crackled with another transmission from the insurgents. "15 minutes remaining, Colonel. We can see your vehicles on the ridge. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sarah picked up the handset, knowing that her next words would either save hundreds of lives or doom them all. "This is Colonel Mitchell. I'm coming down alone as requested, but I want to see all the prisoners before I surrender my weapons." "Agreed. We will display your Marines in the center of the valley. You have 10 minutes to reach the valley floor." Sarah turned to her team, seeing the mixture of respect and fear in their eyes. They all knew this was likely a one-way mission, but not one of them suggested abandoning the plan. These were Marines, and Marines never left anyone behind. "Remember, wait for my signal. No matter what happens to me, don't move until you hear the code word, Thunderbolt, on the radio." Sarah climbed into the lead vehicle and began the descent into the valley, broadcasting her position openly to ensure the insurgents could track her movements. As she drove toward what might be her death, she thought about the oath she had taken 15 years earlier and the responsibility she felt for every Marine under her command. The valley floor was even more treacherous than it had appeared from above. Burned-out vehicles and scattered equipment created a maze of obstacles, while the smell of diesel fuel and cordite hung heavy in the air. Sarah could see insurgents moving into position on both sides of the route, their weapons trained on her vehicle. As she approached the designated meeting point, Sarah saw them, more than 300 Marines kneeling in rows under heavy guard. Many were wounded, their uniforms torn and bloody, but they were alive. The sight filled her with both relief and rage. These were her people, and they had been through hell. An insurgent leader emerged from the group, a tall man with cold eyes and an AK-47 slung across his shoulder. He spoke English with only a slight accent, and Sarah realized he was likely the one who had been communicating with her. "Colonel Mitchell, you are either very brave or very foolish to come here alone." Sarah climbed out of her vehicle slowly, her hands visible but ready to reach for her sidearm. "I'm here as requested. Now I want to see that my Marines are unharmed before we discuss terms." The insurgent leader gestured to his men, who forced several of the kneeling Marines to their feet. Sarah could see that they had been beaten but were alert and responsive. Captain John Williams, Bravo Company's commanding officer, caught her eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. He was alive and still thinking tactically. "As you can see, your Marines are well cared for," the insurgent leader said mockingly. "Now remove your weapons and radio. You will join them as our guests." Sarah reached for her radio, but instead of removing it, she pressed the transmit button. "Thunderbolt, Thunderbolt, Thunderbolt." The valley erupted in chaos as Santos and his teams opened fire simultaneously from their concealed positions. The insurgents, caught completely off guard by the coordinated assault, scrambled to respond to attacks from multiple directions. Sarah drew her sidearm and put 2 rounds in the insurgent leader's chest before diving for cover behind her vehicle. All around her, Marines who had been kneeling in apparent defeat suddenly sprang into action, overpowering their guards and grabbing weapons. Sniper fire was devastatingly effective, eliminating key leaders and heavy weapons operators with precision shots. Santos's team laid down a wall of suppressing fire that prevented the insurgents from organizing an effective counterattack. But the insurgents still outnumbered the Marines, and they began to rally as their initial shock wore off. RPGs streaked across the valley floor, and machine gun fire from prepared positions began to take its toll on the exposed Marines. Sarah found herself fighting alongside Captain Williams and the survivors of Bravo Company, but she quickly realized that despite their initial success, they were still trapped in the valley with limited ammunition and no clear escape route, bringing them home. The firefight raged for 3 hours as Sarah's forces held their ground against overwhelming odds. The Marines had managed to secure several defensive positions using destroyed vehicles and natural rock formations, but ammunition was running dangerously low, and casualties were mounting. Captain Williams crawled over to Sarah's position behind an overturned Humvee. "Ma'am, we've lost radio contact with Santos's team and is down to his last magazine. We need to make a move soon or we're going to be overrun." Sarah looked around at the Marines defending their makeshift perimeter. Many were wounded, all were exhausted, but none showed any sign of giving up. These warriors had been through hell and were still fighting. She felt a surge of pride mixed with the weight of responsibility for their lives. "What's our casualty count?" she asked while returning fire at an insurgent position. 14 killed, 37 wounded. But ma'am, that includes Marines from the original ambush. We've accounted for all 340 members of Bravo Company. No one's been left behind." Despite the desperate situation, Sarah felt a moment of satisfaction. Her decision to break protocol had been vindicated. Without her unauthorized rescue mission, these Marines would have died in insurgent captivity or been executed as threatened. The sound of approaching aircraft suddenly filled the valley, and Sarah looked up to see a formation of Apache attack helicopters cresting the eastern ridge. Behind them came Chinook transport helicopters and FA-18 fighter jets. Command had finally responded with the full weight of American air power. Sarah grabbed her radio, hoping the frequencies hadn't been compromised. "Thunder 6, this is Sentinel Actual. We have friendlies throughout the valley. Be advised, danger close on all targets." The lead Apache pilot's voice came back immediately. "Sentinel Actual, this is Thunder 6. We have eyes on your position, marking insurgent targets now." The next 20 minutes were a devastating display of modern military technology. The Apache helicopters methodically destroyed every insurgent position, while the fighter jets eliminated escape routes and reinforcements. The Chinooks landed under heavy covering fire to evacuate the wounded while Marines provided security. As the evacuation proceeded, Sarah found herself standing beside Major, who had arrived with the relief force. His expression was a mixture of relief and concern. "Sarah, command is furious about your unauthorized mission. There's talk of a court-martial for disobeying direct orders and endangering additional Marines." Sarah watched as stretcher teams loaded the wounded onto the helicopters. Many of these Marines wouldn't be alive if she had followed orders and waited for authorization. "James, sometimes you have to choose between following orders and doing what's right. I can live with the consequences." Santos limped over to them, her left arm in a makeshift sling but her eyes bright with victory. "Ma'am, final count shows 326 Marines evacuated alive. We lost 14 good people, but it could have been so much worse." Sarah felt the weight of those 14 deaths, but she also knew that without her decision to break protocol, the number would have been 340. In the calculus of combat, she had made the right choice, even if it meant the end of her career. The flight back to Fob Sentinel was subdued despite the mission's success. Sarah sat with the wounded Marines, many of whom thanked her for coming after them. Captain Williams, despite his own injuries, sought her out during the flight. "Ma'am, what you did today saved every life on these aircraft. Every Marine in Bravo Company owes you their life. Whatever happens with command, you need to know that." 2 weeks later, Sarah stood at attention in a conference room at Marine Corps headquarters in Washington, D.C. The hearing board consisted of 3 generals, each wearing expressions of stern disapproval. For 2 hours, they had grilled her about her decision to disobey orders and launch an unauthorized rescue mission. General Hayes, the board's senior member, looked down at the stack of documents before her. "Colonel Mitchell, your actions directly violated explicit orders from your commanding officer. You endangered additional Marines and equipment without authorization. How do you justify these actions?" Sarah maintained her composure despite knowing her career was likely over. "Ma'am, 326 Marines are alive today because of that mission. In my judgment, their lives were worth the risk." General Hayes studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "Colonel Mitchell, while your methods were unorthodox and violated protocol, the results speak for themselves. The rescue of Bravo Company has been hailed as one of the most successful operations of this deployment." Sarah felt a glimmer of hope, but remained at attention. "However," the general continued, "we cannot have officers routinely disobeying direct orders regardless of the outcome. You will be transferred to a new assignment where your initiative can be better utilized." 3 months later, Sarah found herself at Camp, California, serving as the director of the Marine Corps' new Advanced Tactical Leadership School. Her mission was to train the next generation of Marine officers in unconventional warfare and crisis decision-making. On her office wall hung a photograph of the 326 Marines she had brought home from that valley in Afghanistan. Each face reminded her why she had chosen duty over protocol, and why sometimes the hardest decisions were also the most necessary. The school's first class of students included many of the survivors from Bravo Company, including Captain Williams and Sergeant Santos. They came to learn from the woman who had proven that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to uphold the values that truly mattered. Sarah's story became legend within the Marine Corps, a reminder that true leadership sometimes required the courage to stand alone against the system in service of something greater. She had paid a price for her choices, but she had brought her Marines home. In the end, that was all that mattered.